So this is the Cold War and this fervent competition with many proxy wars in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, that are essentially rivalries between the US and the Soviet Union for power. It brings us up to Gorbachev and the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. The Soviet system was not effective economically in competition with the US, and the US did everything possible to stop the flow of technology to the Soviet Union to further weaken the Soviet Union. So it wasn't just the system, but it was the active containment policy, so-called, by the United States to try to bring the Soviet Union to its knees. A reformer arose, Mikhail Gorbachev, and he proposed a new approach to end the Cold War, and an approach to peaceful cooperation, reform of the Soviet system, integration between the Soviet Union and the West. And that was from roughly 1986 until the end of the Soviet Union, until 1991. What happened in that attempt by Gorbachev, and we ended up in yet another world order, which you label as this liberal hegemony, so-called, or unipolarity. Take us through those critical transitions from the bipolar Cold War to what America interpreted as the new unipolar America-led world.
Well, as I said before, you have two possible world orders, either the one where you have a balance of power, or one when you recreate Rome, if you will, so another hegemon. And what's interesting is towards the end of the Cold War, seemed like we had both, because from the Helsinki Accords in 1975, we began to develop the foundation for cooperation between East and West. And this is motivated, as you mentioned, with Gorbachev, this idea that you could reform, and he spoke about this common European home, which would transcend this or end this bloc politics. And when the Cold War was announced over in 1989 in Malta, we effectively came with an agreement, the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990, which were built largely on this idea of having an inclusive European security architecture. So one Europe, according to the common European home that Gorbachev had envisioned. And then in 1994, we even translated this into an actual institution, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. So then we already began to lay the foundation for an inclusive Europe based on the Westphalian system. However, this was one of the worlds which would unite, but this is not a world that could accommodate a hegemon, that is a Pax Americana or one based on dominance. So at the same time, they began to speak of how we can preserve the dominance of the United States. And this requires an alliance system, because alliance systems tend to divide the world into weakened adversaries and loyal allies. And this is when you began to already started discussion immediately within the first few months after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that perhaps we should start expand NATO. Even 1 month after the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1 or 2 months, you already had discussions about establishing the Wolfowitz doctrine of how to make sure that no possible rival would emerge. Even 1 month after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Bush Sr. gave his State of the Union, explaining that since the Soviet Union was gone, America was now, he went from being the leader of the West to being the leader of the world. So this aspiration for global dominance, it was there immediately after the Soviet Union collapsed. And this demand or aspiration for hegemony was immediately in direct conflict with this inclusive Europe, which we agreed and to build with the Russians. Because now people often focus on, yes, we did give promise to Gorbachev not to expand 1 inch to the east, but people often neglect that we also signed these pan-European security institutions, which was premised on indivisible security, a Europe without dividing lines. sovereign equality. These are all the concepts from Westphalian system, and we effectively cancelled all of this when we instead decided to expand NATO. Because
this has a very personal aspect for me because I was a young economist at the time and had helped Poland's reforms. I made a number of recommendations which were adopted by the United States on how to help Poland, and they worked by and large. And so I was contacted by Gorbachev's economic team, and I made similar recommendations, and they were all rejected by the United States, the very ones that the U.S. had accepted in the case of Poland, it rejected in the case of the Soviet Union. Then President Yeltsin asked me to also help the new independent Russia in 1992, and I again made recommendations on how the West could help Russia, and they were once again rejected. So I was very unhappy and very puzzled at the time. I was a believer in the common European house. I was a believer in indivisible security. Gorbachev was a kind of hero for me, even if the Russian people were very disgruntled about the worsening economy. I thought Gorbachev was a great visionary statesman and man of peace. Yeltsin said to my face, "We want to be a normal, cooperative, peaceful country and a partner with your country." But the United States, as you say, in the end was interested in something else. It was interested in dominance, not interested in indivisible security. And it's true, I don't mention that part as much. I do mention the NATO enlargement issue. That people should recall that NATO was established to defend Western Europe against a potential Soviet invasion. Well, there was no potential Soviet invasion at the end of the 1980s, and there wasn't even a Soviet Union after December 1991. And so one could ask, what is NATO still doing there? And I think there were very good arguments for disbanding NATO in favor of this framework of the OSCE that you mentioned, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. But the United States was having none of it. Quite the contrary. And amazingly, as you point out, immediately the United States started to expand NATO rather than dismantle it. So what is the mindset there? The mindset is global hegemony, which is what they announced, and they believed it.
Yeah, this is one of the puzzles which we should really explore, because keep in mind that from the early 1990s, the main foreign policy of the Russians and the Chinese, for that sake, was to get as close with the US as possible and the West to pursue peaceful cooperation. But in our narrative, we keep saying that, well, we try to reach out to the Chinese and the Russians. However, how can we explain that both the Russian and Chinese leadership have more or less consistently argued since the 1990s that they were still being contained, that we never gave up on the alliance systems and that we kept balancing them? And of course, they reacted in different ways. The Russians were faced with an expanding NATO, so they tended to punch above their own weight. While the Chinese, they didn't experience an expanding military alliance, so they could take their time and build internal strength and try to cooperate with the US and negotiate an end to this containment. But neither side were successful. And what is remarkable in these days, now that obviously we have a war in Europe, you're not allowed to criticize NATO expansion, but it's worth noting that even Bill Clinton himself, as I cite in the book in January of '94, recognized, well, if we do start expand NATO, it could redivide the continent, obviously, and recreate the logic of the Cold War. And this was common sense. This should have been common sense. Indeed, William Perry, the Secretary of Defense under Clinton, he said the same thing. He considered quitting over this, and he argued everyone in the administration agreed, well, of course this is a betrayal of the Russians. We're going to cancel the entire world order, the European common European home or inclusive system, and instead revive the Cold War. So, and as he said, everyone in the administration recognized that, of course, this was a betrayal, but as according to Perry, who cares, they said. Russia's weak, they're getting weaker. We don't have to take into consideration their security anymore. So all the things we now denounce as Russian propaganda, it's already been confirmed by all of our leaders consistently. It's overwhelming evidence, but we are still not allowed to actually cite their actual words. So it's quite an absurd situation.
Why do you think if Clinton expressed this awareness that maybe this is going to recreate the Cold War, they did it anyway?
Well, I think if they can weaken, if Russia is weak, it doesn't really matter if some of the Cold War dynamic reemerges, as Baker argued at the time. James Baker, he warned against recreating another Cold War, and he also argued against this mentality that we should have NATO as an insurance guarantee against future conflicts with Russia. And everyone recognizes, even people like Madeleine Albright was very favorable of expanding NATO, argued, well, it might create conflict with Russia, but at least if we'll have a conflict with Russia, we'll have them surrounded by NATO. And it's fascinating to go through the Senate debates, because these are all in the archives now. It's all accessible. And when they debated expanding NATO in the 90s, the phrase security guarantee. Insurance. What is it?
Security insurance.
Security insurance. Yeah. This word comes up over and over again, and indeed, it's not that bad if the Russians lash out a little bit, because if they do lash out, then it will only convince the Europeans to further accept American leadership in case we'll have problems with the Russians in the future. So all of this was so obvious and so predictable. Indeed, the American architect for the containment policies, George Kennan, he even outlined it all in an interview in '98, where he said, well, of course, this is going to start a new Cold War, and predicting once the new Cold War begins, we're going to blame the Russians for their imperialist nature. And he said, this is all nonsense. This makes no sense. Even, Jack Matlock, which I also spoke to many times, he argues the same thing. Of course, we betrayed the Russians. We negotiated an end to Cold War. We're going to have a common peace, and we betrayed it. So it's quite, the historical revisionism is just shocking. So, and it's so weird because all the evidence is there, which is why the book is very heavily cited. But it appears in debates these days. No one really cares anymore about the facts. We're so committed to the narrative that we're willing to reject facts, even though they're not disputed. It's, again, quite extraordinary.
So essentially, 1991, the Soviet Union ends, and the U.S. could pursue a policy of indivisible security, a common European home. But it decides to pursue a policy of global hegemony. And that involves expanding its military reach, expanding NATO, essentially dismissing Russia's security interests entirely. As you say, the American view was based on the attitude, well, if Russia objects, what can they do? They're so weak anyway. And my experience, looking back, because I wasn't aware of it at the time, China played very little role that I know of, and I never heard concern about China. The only thing I heard about China was that the East Asian miracle is a myth, was the predominant view in the 1990s. Don't worry about China, they just are villagers growing rice, and nothing much to worry about there. So there was an enormous amount of American hubris, and it led to continued expansion of the military, continued growing insecurity of Russia. Take us just in a quick moment how that led to the breakout of the Ukraine war. And then I want to ask you a question about European views about all of this.
Yeah, well, let me just say first, I don't dismiss the idea that many in Washington perhaps had good intentions, because under the idea of liberal hegemony, the assumption was if there's one center of power, it will mitigate the international anarchy. There will be no great power rivalry if no country can even have the aspirations to rival the United States. Also, with the dominance of the US as the new Pax Romana, they can elevate the role of liberal democratic values in the system. So many people probably believed in this, but as we know, over time, the old values become corrupted when they're only in service of building this dominance. And this is what we also saw in Ukraine, because many of the countries in Europe, from the Baltic states to Poland, they obviously had good historical reasons to fear Russia. So if they were given the option of having a common Europe, or only removing the dividing lines of Europe, or instead moving the dividing lines to eastwards, so they end up on the right side of this bloc politics, they favor the bloc politics. So I don't dismiss this. But Ukraine was different. Between 91 and 2014, every poll, doesn't matter who did the poll, every poll showed that barely 20% of Ukrainians would want to join NATO. NATO owns documents even suggested this was a great problem. What can we do? How can we improve our relationship with Ukraine when the people don't want it, when their own legal system opposes it? So this was a huge problem for NATO if you want to expand. And not only did we know that Ukrainians did not want to be a part of NATO, but as we learned from many people, from Merkel, from the various European ambassadors, they all said the same thing, that if we try to bring this reluctant Ukraine into NATO, we're going to have civil war and likely a Russian invasion. Even the CIA director of the United States, William Burns, he wrote this in 2008 when we began to roll the ball by pushing for, when we promised Ukraine future NATO membership. He argued...
He at the time was U.S. ambassador to Russia. So now as the CIA director, at the time he was right there in Moscow as the U.S. ambassador, and he sent home a memo. This is very dangerous.
Yeah, not only would Russia invade, but at the end he adds, this is a decision Russia does not want to make. And this kind of goes strictly against our argument about a non-provoked Russian invasion, because if it's, how can you say it's not provoked if Burns himself recognizes Russia would have to invade, even though it doesn't want to do so. It's responding to NATO. Even the former British ambassador to Moscow, I forgot his name, Roderick Lyne. Yeah, he also argued the same, that in 2020, if we want to start a war with Russia, he said, this is the best way to do it. Pull in a Ukraine which never wanted to be a part of NATO to begin with. It was very predictable, but again, our narrative has become completely immune to facts.
So let me ask you, we're in the middle of this war that you and I see, and I have seen a lot of it close up, came from the U.S. relentlessly pressuring Russia, and not only in what we've talked about, but also new missile systems put in, U.S. leaving the anti-ballistic missile treaty, U.S. leaving the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, and so forth. The U.S. participating in the overthrow of a neutral government in Ukraine, after all, in 2014. Now, the European leaders seem to know all of this was provocative and dangerous all along. I remember speaking to Norwegian leaders during this period. They were very much upset with George W. Bush for pushing NATO membership. We know that Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, was warning the United States, don't provoke a new division in Europe. So the risks were known to Europe. The worst cases emerged. But now we don't hear this debate in Europe, other than by brilliant analysts like you. But we don't hear it from the political leaders of Europe. Almost none. There are a couple. Viktor Orban in Hungary and Fico in Slovakia, but very, very few. So why is Europe so much on the narrative right now?
I'm not sure how they ended up so extreme. But you are right. In 2008, not only did the Europeans resist it, in Angela Merkel's own words, if we offer a NATO membership to Ukraine, the Russians will interpret it as a declaration of war. But even within the American camp, you had people like Condoleezza Rice and even Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who also recognized this was not a good idea. But again, Bush, he pushed for it, and the Europeans, they knew it was dangerous, but they accepted it anyways. And they allowed themselves to pressure by Washington. And then gradually, of course, you have then the conflicts beginning, and even by 2014, the instinct of the Europeans, the Germans and the French at least, was to negotiate an end to this. When war predictably broke out, as everyone had predicted, they negotiated this Minsk agreement and to get an end to this. So give some autonomy to Donbass, which could also prevent NATO expansion. So we could have a peaceful settlement. And they negotiated this. Everyone in the whole United Nations confirmed, yes, this is the only path to peace. Every meeting we have, we keep saying this is the only path to peace. And later on, we learned that the Europeans even themselves only saw this as an opportunity to rearm Ukraine. And if you forward all the way to now to see what's happened in Europe, now we have the new incoming foreign, so it's a foreign policy chief of the EU, Kaja Kallas, who calls for breaking up Russia in small pieces. She doesn't want diplomacy with Russia because they are war criminals. And it's when people like Orban travels to Ukraine and Russia and China to try to start some diplomacy, they call him a Russian puppet and try to punish him for trying diplomacy. So it's quite extraordinary to sit there in Europe. And, I watched the EU for years and years, always have the same solution to any conflict around the world, which is at least sit down and start to talk. And now we have 2.5 years where we criminalize diplomacy. You're not allowed to talk to the adversary. And as my former Prime Minister and now former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg argues, weapons are the path to peace, while diplomacy is appeasement. So we completely lost our minds, and no one even defines what it means to defeat the world's largest nuclear power, who considers this to be an existential threat. So it's a complete madness, and it's very frustrating because all the evidence is there, but no one is allowed to reference it unless they want to be accused of, carrying water for Putin or this kind of rhetoric.
And you point out, well, this is not sitting still. The war does not go in Ukraine's favor, to say the least. But this is leading to a new Eurasian order. So can you tell us what that means and what could be the Eurasian order?
Well, I think the Eurasian order, it was spearheaded first by China and Russia in terms of building a new alternative economic structure. So they look for their own industries, their own technological hubs. They're developing more cooperation in natural resources, for example, grain corridor. They're setting up these new transportation corridors. The development banks, use of local currencies, digital payment systems. So across the board, they have a lot of different initiatives. So that's the economic platform, but it reflects a wider political system which they want to accommodate. So what they're looking for is effectively a new Westphalian international system. So whenever we talk about the Chinese trying to replace the American hegemon, I would reply that there's no evidence for this, because if you want a hegemon, you have to do what the Americans did. If you have to try to cut Russia off from the Turks, from Central Asia. Whenever we reach out to country, be it Georgia, Ukraine, we always try to sever them from Russia because we want to weaken adversaries. Mm-hmm. Well, how does the Chinese respond to Russia trying to diversify, not to be too dependent only on China, when they reach out to India or Iran or Korea, any other country? China does nothing. And this is why we assumed 10 years ago that the Russians and Chinese would clash over Central Asia, but none of them are pursuing hegemony there. So they're both able to accommodate each other. And even in the Chinese rhetoric, are they talking about universal values in which they can represent other peoples? No, they talk about plural, a multitude of civilizations, co-harmonizing. Every civilization have their own path to development. We should embrace this. And this is very different, because if they wanted hegemony, they would say, this one universal path. We are the leader of this path, and so we will help you by representing your people. And this is, replicate effectively the liberal hegemonic order, in which the United States says liberal democratic values are universal. We are the champion of it, which means we can effectively use this to promote sovereign inequality, in which we can police the rest of the world and represent other peoples, like the French or the Bolshevik.
Fascinating insight that China's not behaving that way as a would-be hegemon. And you also make a fascinating aside that a sea-based hegemon like Britain, or you could argue the United States with its dominant navy for the last half century and more, governs by divide and rule, whereas you say that land-based powers press more for cooperation. Could you just say a word about that difference as you see it?
Yeah, this builds on some of the ideas of Mackinder, of course, but this is, if you're the sea-based, you control the great Eurasian landmass or any continent from the periphery, and you maintain your maritime hegemon if you're able to keep division between the others. Now, if you're a land power, be it China or Russia, you're often dependent on having, physical connectivity across land. Then you're more pressured to, instead of divide and rule, to accommodate other states. So, for example, China and Russia have different visions of Eurasia, but they both need each other to achieve each other's vision. So if China alienates Russia, even though Russia's weaker, Russia can create a lot of trouble. They are, they're connecting all of Eurasia. They can create problem everywhere. So the Chinese know if they want their vision of Eurasia, they need to cooperate with the Russians. And so everyone's kind of looking to accommodate and harmonize. And this is a very different system. So
that's fascinating, and I think very, very, very believable that an outside power like Britain or the United States, which is trying to balance a continental power, goes from the outside in, and so you're trying to divide the landmass, whereas the inside power needs connectivity, and so you actually need to cooperate.
Yeah, and you see the evidence is there as well, because when the Chinese negotiated, because they wanted to get as close as possible with Iran, but they didn't want to alienate the Arabs. So what do? They promote a peace between the Arabs and Iranians. When this happens, what does the United States do? It panics a bit, because now it loses an ally to contain the Iranians, and also without a conflict, suddenly the Arabs aren't that obedient and loyal anymore. Suddenly they start trading with China, Russia. This is not acceptable. This is also why I see whenever there's conflict between India and some tension between India and China, how excited the media gets, because now the Indians might begin to give up on this non-alignment and pledge some loyalty to the West and help us contain the Chinese. And it's, of course, we saw the same with the Europeans. During the post-Cold War era, when there was no more conflicts, peace broke out. So they began to pursue strategic autonomy through the European Union. They talked about European independence, strategic autonomy, these kind of things. European sovereignty. And now no one does anymore. Now they're retreating back under the US. So they can contain the Russians. The Europeans are back at their obedient self. But you don't see the same coming from China now. They're actually encouraging cooperation now or peace between the different countries, because if there's too much divisions on this greater Eurasian continent, their ability to cooperate with any one of them is diminished. So I think it's, as we're convinced by leaders all the time, the world is divided between the good liberal democracies and the evil authoritarian. I think it's good to have some more nuance to see actually what the countries are promoting and why.
Glenn, you've been spreading these very wise ideas and this knowledge of history, and suddenly you're off of YouTube. It was a shock. What happened?
Yeah, it was a shock to me as well, because, it was a few days ago, I got an email from YouTube saying that their artificial intelligence or their automated systems had detected the hate speech on my YouTube channel, and they had therefore deleted the channel. And you're allowed to contest it, but then you get another automated email saying, well, we have decided this is the case. So there's not actually any people involved. So it's very, very dystopian. And of course, the reason for deleting this as well has been quite extraordinary, because hate, I must have recorded hundreds of hours with different economists, political leaders, and military leaders. It's unclear to me who I would actually hate. I don't have any.
I've never heard a word of hate from you.
No,
period.
It's I mean,
calm, if I may say, Norwegian, measured, analytical. Never a word of venom or hate. Only explanation. Well, I'm going to do my little bit to see if I could in any way get past the machine there at Google and talk to somebody. We need you back very much online in every way. And I'm very grateful for your analysis and for this book. I want to thank you for joining the book club. We've been speaking with the Professor Glenn Deason, and his book, The Ukraine War and the Eurasian World Order, is must reading if you want to understand the world we're in, the dangers, and how events must unfold. Professor Deason provides a absolutely striking and evidence-rich and very wise analysis. So I want to thank you and hope that you have a very wide readership for this important book.
No, thank you so much.
Great to be with you. And thank you. That is a book club with Jeffrey Sachs. Thank you for joining.